Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on navigating the federal CSBG Act that is targeted to legal teams at state CSBG offices. I'm Katie Kajowski with NASCASP. This is a joint production this afternoon between NASCASP and CapLaw. I'm going to do a couple of housekeeping things. The first one is on your screen. You should see a file transfer window. If you would like to download the PowerPoint presentation for this webinar, you can click on the file name, Navigating Federal CSBG Act, and then click Download on that file transfer. It will allow you to download the slides for this webinar. Please note that we will also be posting the slides to our member portal as well as the recording of this webinar. So your opportunity at later points in time to obtain this material as well. We have muted everybody, and if you have any questions as we go through the webinar, please put them into your chat window or your Q&A window, and we will answer them as we go along. We also unmute everyone at the end of this webinar to see if there are any questions that you would like to ask verbally to us. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Eleanor Evans and Veronica Zhang of CapLaw.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Eleanor Evans, Executive Director of CapLaw. Here's my colleague, Veronica Zhang, CapLaw staff attorney, and we're here today to walk you through the basics of the Federal Community Services Block Grant Act. And the presentation is particularly aimed at attorneys who work with and support CSBG offices, but it's also appropriate particularly for new staff to CSBG offices as well, who may not be familiar with some of the CSBG basics. Community Action Program Legal Services is one of the 4 national CSBG network partner organizations, and we provide legal governance and grant management, training, and technical assistance to the CSBG network, which includes resources for attorneys working with community action agencies and with CSBG. And if after the webinar you have a chance to go to our website, which is www.caplaw.org, you'll see that we have a tab for the attorney network on our website. And if you go there, you'll find other webinars that we've done for attorneys who work in this field with community action agencies and with CSBG. And some of the webinars may be of particular interest to attorneys who work with state CSBG offices, including legal issues unique to CAA's nuts and bolts of subgrant agreements and closing the door strategies for CAAs unable to survive. We are doing a digest for attorneys of that we've written on in the past year that are of particular to attorneys who work with CSBG and community action agencies. And so if you'd like to get on the list to receive those updates in the future and to find out about future webinars and resources for CapLaw attorneys, please go to the Attorney Network page of our website. If you're with the CSBG office and your attorney is not on the phone or on the line here on the computer, we do urge you to share the recording of the webinar and the slides with any attorneys who might assist your CSBG office. So with all that talk about attorneys, we wanted to do our first poll of the webinar and find out how many of you are at or working with your state CSBG office. So we're going to put up the poll now, and it's a pretty simple answer, yes or no, and so we'll let you know when a poll is about to close.
On the right-hand side of your screen.
So hope people have located where it is on the screen and answered. And we'll close it shortly.
So 59% have answered.
Okay. If you find it, please put your answer down. It's not meant to be a tough question. We're just curious to know who's in the audience. We should close it and find out what the results are.
Okay, closing in about 5 seconds.
Okay, so we have a minority of folks on the phone are attorneys, and we thank you very much for joining us today because it's very important to us to reach to you and to provide resources to you as well as to your colleagues in state offices, who I'm assuming are the other 53% or so of folks on the webinar. So thanks to all of you for joining us, and that's very helpful for us to know who's in the audience today. Turn it over now to Veronica, and then we'll tag teaming it for the rest of the presentation.
Great. So just by going over some of over the CSBG Act as well as its purposes and goals. And so for you who are in state offices who have worked with the CSBG Act, you know that it's codified at 42 United States Code, Section 9901. Federal CSBG Act really spells out 3 main goals and purposes of the CSBG program. And those are to provide assistance to states working through a network of community action agencies and other neighborhood-based organizations to first reduce poverty, second to revitalize low-income communities, and third to empower low-income families and individuals to become fully self-sufficient. I think it's sometimes useful to have a little bit of history of CSB and to know where it came from, and that informs its current purposes and goals. The history of CSBG really traces back to the Opportunity Act, which was passed in 1964 and was the piece of President Johnson's War on Poverty. The Opportunity Act was the federal government's attempt at really mobilizing local agencies to fight poverty, was responsive to specific local needs. So these organizations became known as community action agencies. Time funding was provided directly from the federal government. The sort of structure of CSBG has changed, and in 1981, Congress passed legislation repealing the Economic Opportunity Act and turning CSBG along with other direct funding sources into block grants. So for CSBG, it's specifically the Community Services Block Grant. The idea behind this change was really to reduce federal spending on some of these programs and to limit the federal government's role in social programs. Instead, really passed the baton to states and transferred responsibilities and authority for operating those programs to state offices. And CSBG has, since 1981, been a block grant where states have a significant amount of discretion and authority to administer the program. So the CSBG Act does indicate how it envisions these 3 purposes and goals to be achieved, and so these are just some of the strategies of the CSBG Act. I think one to just really highlight here is the first one, which is the maximum participation of low-income communities. When CSBG became a block grant, it really maintained that idea that these programs should be operated and administered with maximum participation of the communities who are to be served, and reflected in some of the governance requirements that we'll talk about later in this presentation. CSBG also seeks to leverage the resources of other anti-poverty programs and as well as the Economic Opportunity Act. The goal of CSBG is to help link and connect other programs in the community to avoid duplication of services and to really be able to reach the community that it's serving. And so these are the strategies by which CSBG envisions achieving these goals. I just want to point out that for those of you who are working with community action agencies, CSBG may not be, and usually is not, a community action agency's largest funding source, but it does have significance for community action agencies, first because of that leveraging strategy that I mentioned earlier, where the goal is not just to fund a specific program, but to enable the community action agency to link and support other programs that it is already currently operating. And secondly, because the CSBG Act specifies that each community action agency has to have a specific board composition, the tripartite board. And so two sort of reasons make the CSBG Act something that a community action agency sort of be aware of the complete requirements for. It may not be its largest funding source. Talk a little bit about the laws and guidance that apply to C. And so on the federal level, first there's the federal CSBG Act, which I mentioned earlier. But the CSBG is a block grant, primarily responsible for grant administration, and they have more flexibility and discretion in their interpretation of the federal statute authorizing the program. So those of you working at state CSBG offices, the state have discretion as well as flexibility to interpret the federal act, as well as to impose additional requirements, which we'll talk about on the next slide. There are also HHS block grants. So CSBG is administered by the Federal Department of Health and Human Services under the Office of Community Services, OCS, and HHS has general block grant regulations that apply to CSBG, and this just reiterates that states are primarily responsible for interpreting block grant statutes. The CSBG Act does give HHS the authority to issue other rules and regulations that provide for enforcement of the Act, and particularly for the activity restrictions. And as you'll see, CSBG is a bit of a unique block grant in that there are more specific federal rules than the typical federal block grant. So at the federal level, OCS, or the Office of Community Services, also issues additional guidance that's specific to the CSBG program. They issue these in the form of information memorandum, or IMs, and these are non-binding guidance. They do serve as good indication of OCS's interpretation of federal CSBG Act and regulations, and are helpful for when OCS is monitoring states on as recipients of CSBG funding. Though CSBG terms and conditions that I'm not going to go into, but these really set forth the rules that a grantee agrees to comply with. So states as grantees agree to comply with when they receive the CSBG funding. When it does receive that funding, they become bound by these terms and conditions. And you can find copies of both the IMs as well as the terms and conditions on OCS's website. Lastly, states have to complete CSBG state plans, and so that's information that OCS has requested from states, and need to fill that out on an annual basis.
And I just make a note that the state plans, as we'll talk about, are required by the CSBG Act, and so as is similar to other block grants, the state is required to complete the state plan in order to get funding. And because it is a block grant, HHS is somewhat limited in its ability to issue regulations. One area, as Veronica mentioned, where HHS has authority is in respect to regulations, enforcement of the Act's political activity restrictions. But generally, OCS does not have broad authority to make regulations relating to the Act, and this can be a source of frustration both for community action agencies because sometimes people want more clarity about, well, what does the act mean? And because it's a block grant, OCS, generally doesn't issue regulations, and they issue these items that are non-binding guidance. And it's, in a lot of cases, it is up to the state to figure out what the act means and to follow through accordingly.
In addition to the federal laws and guidance, states will often enact law regulations that help facilitate or flesh out the federal CSBG Act. So state, you may have legislation that has been passed by your state legislature or regulations promulgated by agencies. State offices sometimes will also have more informal CSBG policies or procedures that might take the form of a policy manual or a procedures handbook. And then, of course, states will often enter into contracts, agreements with the community action agencies and either pass along some of the terms and conditions that the federal government has imposed on the state or add additional terms and conditions. And to note that where state CSB laws or guidance conflict with federal act will govern, but there is deference that is afforded to state interpretation of the federal CSBG Act. One other area that, if you're working at the office, you're familiar with are the CSBG organizational standards, which were developed by the Center of Excellence. They're meant to be a comprehensive set of standards that all CSBG eligible entities have the capacity to provide high quality services. When these organizational standards were released via IM 138, states were given the option to either adopt the organizational standards as written or to amend or add additional organizational standards. And so it will just depend on the state you're in and what your state has chosen to do with those organizational standards. But those rules would also apply to a CAA. Last source of guidance we'll talk about is the uniform. These are the set of administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit rules that apply generally to federal grantees. The federal CSBG Act states that states ensure that the cost and accounting standards of the federal OMB apply to recipients of CSBG funds. Again, because CSBG is a block grant, the uniform guidance does not apply to community action agencies in its entirety. So by default, only, as you'll see, there are 6 subparts to the uniform guidance, and only subparts A, B, and F apply in their entirety. For Part C and subpart D, there are only specific sections that apply to CSBG recipients. And notably, the procurement rules and the record retention rules that are in subpart D do not automatically apply to community action agencies. Again, different states may choose to do different things with the uniform guidance in terms of what they ask community action agencies to comply with, but the uniform guidance does not apply in its entirety to community action agencies.
So in contracts with community action agencies, it's important to be clear about which subparts of the uniform guidance apply, and if you want sub D, which Veronica mentioned includes things like procurement, if you want that to apply, then to clear about that in your state contracts.
We'll go to our next question, which is also our first quiz question. And so this question asks, which of the following is legally binding on a CAA? And so you should see a poll open up to the screen, and we're asking you to select all that you think apply in this case. So we'll just leave the poll open for 30 or so to give folks a chance to respond. And this is to help us track or talk. maybe just 10 more seconds to get your answers in, and then we can go ahead and close the poll. Let's see, the results were.
The poll will close in 5 seconds.
So it looks like there were choices, but so the answers here are B, the federal CSBG Act, C, HS block grant regulations, E, uniform guidance cost principles, and F, CSBG subgrants between the states and the CAAs. The reason the Economic Opportunity Act, or answer A, does not apply is that it was repealed in 1981 and replaced by the federal CSBG Act. And for answer D, OCS CSBG information memoranda, these, again, are non-binding guidance issued by the Federal Office of Community Services that are meant to be instructive, but are not legally binding on a community action agency. So with that, we'll move on to talk about CSBG funding, and I'll turn it over to Eleanor.
Okay, great. So CSBG, as we've been talking about, is clearly a block grant, but it is somewhat of a unique block grant in that states have less leeway in administering it than they do with many other block grant programs. So, for example, states do not have much discretion to choose which local organizations receive CSBG funds. They pass through 90% of the funds that the states receive to the statute calls quote-unquote eligible entities. And for purposes of this presentation, eligible entity and CAA or community action agency are interchangeable, but the statute uses the term eligible entities. A state cannot reduce or terminate a CAA's funding below the proportion that the CAA or eligible entity received in the previous year without following certain specified procedures, including providing notice and an opportunity for a hearing, and we'll be talking about that later in the presentation. And we'll talk about this later as well. CAA's programs and services are determined on the basis of local community needs and a needs assessment, and that's because of the emphasis since the 1960s on the Economic Opportunity Act and now the CSBG Act around local control and local self-determination. And so the decisions about the programs and services are determined at the local level rather than by the state. CSBG funding may be used also not only to provide direct services, but also, as Veronica mentioned at the beginning, to provide linkages and to coordinate anti-poverty efforts in the community. And in words of an OCS Nation Memorandum 37 that we'll talk about later, to undertake a very broad range of activities, including linking and strengthening other anti-poverty programs and services. In addition, just back to that previous slide for a sec. So states may use so the 90% goes to the eligible entities. The state may use D5000 or 5%, whichever is greater, for its own state CSBG administrative costs, and then remaining funds, which we call state discretionary funds, must be used for certain CSBG authorized purposes. And these are listed on this slide. So they are discretionary funds, but that doesn't mean that the state has complete discretion. The states must use those for the purposes specified in the Act, and some allowable uses include training and technical assistance, coordinating state-operated programs and services relating to anti-poverty efforts that are, I think, in the community, supporting statewide coordination and communication among eligible entities, supporting innovative programs that are conducted by CAAs or other neighborhood-based organizations around poverty issues. So the CSBG Act does not limit organizations receiving grants for those purposes to CAAs. In fact, many states will choose to some of their discretionary funds to the state association of community action agencies for training and technical assistance, and some states choose to use their discretionary funds to make grants exclusively to CAA associations and to CAAs. In cases, state CSBG laws or regulation may require the state to use its discretionary funds only to support CAAs and CAA associations. It does have some, generally, except states where that's the case, has some flexibility in how to spend those discretionary funds, but be sure to check the list in the CSBG statute to ensure that how you're proposing to use those funds lines up with that list in the statute. Then the process of providing the CSBG funding from the federal government to the states is that the state submits its state application and plan to HHS, to the Office of Community Services there, and it is, as I'm sure those of you who've helped with this plan know, it's a very set document where you answer questions and check boxes describing how you're going to spend the money and operate the program. And that document also, in that document, the state also makes certain assurances in order to comply with the CSBG Act. To appropriate the funds, and this time of year we're always wondering, is Congress going to come through and appropriate before October 1st, which is the start of the federal fiscal year, or are they going to do a continuing resolution? So I won't get into what's going to happen this year, but it's that Congress has to take that step and appropriates the funds. The Federal Office of Management and Budget apportions the funds that have been appropriated to Congress, and they do this to ensure that the funds are not spent all at once, so they spread the fund over the course of the year. HHS sends quarterly allocation letters to the states saying how much money each state is getting on a quarterly basis, and these allocations are based on a historical formula. In terms of getting the funding from the states to the community action agencies, each community action agency submits an application to the state that includes its community action plan and a budget, specifying how it's going to use the funds, and the decisions about priorities and how to use the funds are to be based on that community needs assessment that I mentioned that's required by the CSBG Act. The states review the application, but generally they don't substitute their judgment for the local decision-making around what the community needs are and, to prioritize those needs in the community. Once application is approved and presumably Congress has appropriated money, the state enters into a CSBG contract with the Community Action Agency, which is a sub-grant agreement under the Uniform Guidance. In the state, those CSBG funds come from the federal government, may be appropriated by your state's legislature before the state may spend those funds. And sometimes we've seen issues in states where there's been a budget impasse in the legislature or between the legislature and the governor, where the federal funds are sitting there and ready, they can't be spent by the state CSBG office because they haven't been appropriated at the state level. And so sometimes challenges arise there, and in some cases there may be an opportunity for the community action agencies to put in the Federal Office of Community Services for direct funding should that happen. So we have another quiz now. It's a true-false this time. So the first question is, a state decide to award less than 90% of its CSBG allotment to CAAs, true-false? And then the question is, a state can require a CAA to use CSBG funds to support statewide initiatives, even if it is not in line with needs identified in the CAA's needs assessment, true or false? A few moments to pick answers there. Okay, about 4 seconds. look at the polls closed. Good job. So folks responded well to this. The first answer is false. A state may not decide to award less than 90% of its CSBG allotment to community action agencies in the state. Under the federal CSBG Act, the state must award at least 90% to the CAAs. I know there are some states actually where, like I mentioned before, where the state choose or have a law or regulation that requires it to put all discretionary money to the CAAs as well, but the state has to give at least 90% to eligible entities. And then the second question as well is also false. A state not require a CAA to use CSBG funds to support statewide initiatives if it's not in line with the community needs identified in the CAA's local needs assessment. So good job. So I talk a little bit about CSBG performance management. There's been a particular push to look at performance management across the network and at different levels in our network, from the federal to the state to the local. And so I just wanted to talk about, quickly run through a few aspects of those, from the connection theory of change to the CSBG organizational standards that Veronica mentioned, to what's called LMA. 10 state plans. We're not going to go into detail in this webinar. It being a webinar, we're unfortunately not able to cover all aspects of the CSBG Act, and so, but wanted to hit on some of the major ones. But I also wanted to refer folks to a publication that CAB has on our website called the CAA Leaders Legal Guide, as several chapters, one of which is all about CSBG. So I would urge you to take a look at that for more detail about the CSBG Act. So the action theory of change is intended to provide a graphic overview of the core principles, performance management framework, and services and strategies that are implemented and led by the nationwide Community Action Network to achieve the goals of community action and the CSBG Act across the country. And so, as you probably know, we're talking nationwide network. There are about or over 1,000 community action agencies across the country, as well as the state associations that I mentioned, the state offices. There are also regional associations and consortia called RPICs, regional consortia of states and state associations, as well as the 4 national partners, and then our federal partners at OCS that are all working together in this network to achieve the goals listed here on the slide. So this is just something that I wanted folks to be aware. NASCAP has done the lion's share of the work on moving this theory of change forward and to the, to where it is now, and issuing it across the network with, working with CS on it. And it's so helpful to describe and to show people about what the work is all about and the different levels of the network and what core principles we operate under and what our goals are and how we achieve those goals. Organizational standards, and they are now in place. They were published in OCS Information Memorandum 138, as Veronica mentioned, were developed through the Organizational Standards of Excellence, Center of Excellence, which is the National Community Action Partnership, and there was a network-wide effort to come to some consensus around the standards. And under the CSBG appropriations language, OCS was given the authority to require states to adopt these organizational standards. Because these are rules of general applicability, we at CAB Law think that it's best if, when states adopt the org standards, which these states have done, but we think it's best for you out there to check your state's Administrative Procedure Act to see if there are certain procedures that your state office needs to follow in terms of adopting the organizational standards. For example, do they need to be adopted as regulations? And if so, are there certain notice and comment procedures that were followed or may not followed when the standards were adopted in your state? Or could they just simply be included in the state CSBG contracts with the community action agencies? So that's something that we would urge state offices and attorneys to confer on, just to make sure that when they adopted the org standards that was done appropriate under your state's law. There are into 3 thematic groups, and then there are sort of 9 categories of standards, and I'm not going to go into detail about them, except to just point out that there are slightly different standards for public community action agencies, in other words, governmental community action agencies that are part of local government versus nonprofit community action agencies, which make up the majority of the network. So nonprofit CAAs have 58 standards that they need to follow, and the public action agencies have 50 standards that they follow. Another piece of performance management is the results-oriented management and accountability, or ROMA system, and the federal CSBG Act requires state plans to an assurance that the state and all eligible entities will participate in this ROMA system. And just to say a few things about ROMA, it's a performance-based initiative, and it's designed to preserve the anti-poverty focus of community action and to promote greater effectiveness among state and local agencies that receive CSBG funds. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about their ROMA report, and a lot of times, and especially until the ROMA Next Generation effort started in the last few years, I think there was a lot of misunderstanding around ROMA, and at times people just thought it was about reporting their results or sending a report to the state each year that then the state would send to OCS. But thanks to the efforts of NASCASP and many other folks in the network and the National Association of Certified ROMA Trainers, there's been a lot more emphasis put on trying to get folks to understand that it's this cycle that was developed, 15 or 20 years ago, or at least this was developed, I think, in 2006, but it really helps you understand that it's sort of a whole process that the organization follows when planning its activities using the needs assessment to assess needs, implementing its how it's going to fulfill those needs and meet its priorities, looking at what kind of results are being achieved and evaluating those results. And so these are all part of ROMA cycle that's shown here on the slide. And like I mentioned, there's been an effort to have ROMA Next Generation, which is a system for continuous quality improvement to enable the network to measure, analyze, and communicate performance. And the idea was to take the ROMA initiative and the existing ROMA and these, and to activate it more through training and through coming at it through a 21st century lens. And so part of that is resulting in is a new format for the annual report that send to, or that CAAs report on, that goes to the state that then goes to OCS. But that is only a part of the whole ROMA process and cycle. And the new CSBG annual report is discussed in an information memorandum from OCS called Information Memorandum 152. And OCS takes information from that report and puts it together in a report that it submits annually to Congress. All right, so we have another quiz here. Where might one find references to the CSBG organizational standards? In the federal CSBG Act? Would it know HHS block grant regulations? Could it in OCS IM 138, state CSBG regulations, and or state contracts with CAAs? So please answer all that apply. Any place where you think you might see references to the CSBG organizational standards. about 10 more seconds, and then we'll close the poll. Looks like it's ended. Oh, well, great. I think you got the reference to OCS IM 138. That is the document that the Federal Office of Community Services issued rolling out the org standards and giving instructions to the states about what to do with the org standards and how to promulgate them. Some states may have incorporated the organizational standards into their state CSBG regulations if they have them. Veronica said some states have them, some states don't, and among those that have CSBG regulations, some have incorporated the org standards into those regulations. As I suggested before to attorneys, you may want to check what the Administrative Procedures Act requires in a way of adopting the org standards and whether that is needed to be done through a regulation. And I would say most, if not states, the contracts with CAAs also reference the organizational standards and require CAAs to follow the organizational standards in those contracts. These are not mentioned in the Federal CSBG Act, and that's because it was passed in 1981 and it was last reauthorized in 1998, and that was before the organizational standards were developed, which in the last few years. And similarly, non-HHS block grant regulations, which were issued a long time ago as well.
So we'll switch gears now and talk about two distinguished features about CSBG and why it assumes more significance than the VA's funding source might indicate. And the first being that the CSBG Act requires community action agencies to have a specific board structure, which is known as the tripartite board structure, and then also because of the ways that CSBG funds can be spent. So we'll talk about the board. So the Act requires that community action agencies maintain a tripartite board. This is a hallmark of community action and a carryover from the predecessor statute, the Economic Opportunity Act. So the requirement that the board be composed of 3 sectors, at least 1/3 of the board has to be made up of low-income sector representatives. So these are folks who represent the low-income communities that you're serving. Exactly 1/3 of the board has to be made up of public officials, and those can be elected public officials, or if there aren't enough elected public officials who are reasonably available and willing to serve, then appointed public officials can fill those spots as well. And the remaining seats are made up of private sector representatives. A common conception is that the board has to be evenly divided into 3s, and the reality is that though the Act requires that exactly 1/3 of the board be made up of public officials, you can have more than 1/3 of the board be made up of low-income representatives and have a smaller than 1/3 private sector composition. That's the federal CSBG Act, and you would also need to look at your state CSBG regulations, CSBG statute, to see if there are additional requirements, but many states do track the federal CSBG Act language. The federal CSBG Act also requires that the board be fully engaged in the development, planning, implementation, and evaluation of the community action agencies programs. Some of the CSBG organizational standards that Eleanor referenced apply to what boards need to be able to demonstrate, to show their involvement in, and this can involve developing and approving the community needs assessment, to having a strategic plan for the agency, and our implementation. Board members are expected to fulfill fiduciary duties. They're legally required to do that under their Nonprofit Corporation Act if we're talking about a nonprofit community action agency, and oftentimes public community action agencies may have duties that are imposed under local government law. and then also have to be involved in the evaluation of those programs. These sort of 4 activities do track the Roma cycle that Eleanor referenced earlier. I think one thing is just that the powers of a community action agency's board really depend on whether that community action agency is a nonprofit community agency or a public agency. Nonprofit community action agencies are also subject to nonprofit corporate law or state. Those generally give boards broad powers to manage the affairs of the corporation, and oftentimes a nonprofit CA's bylaws will specify that. For public CAAs, the board's powers will really depend on the authority that's delegated to it by the local governing body. But again, the federal act does specify public CAA boards administer the CSBG program, and so public community action boards are not intended to be advisory only. They are expected to and should have a role in administering the CSBG program at the community action agency. So the slides are about the use of CSBG funds. So the Federal Community Services Block Grant Act requires that in order to be eligible for services funded by CSBG, that clients have to be at or below 100% of the federal poverty line. How the state may permit CSBG services to be provided to clients up to 125% of the federal poverty line if it determines that doing so serves the objectives of the CSBG program, and many states have chosen to do so. Community agencies should use the most current HHS poverty guidelines when assessing income eligibility, and the current guidelines are always published in the Federal Register. And they're also available on the HHS website. When determining eligibility, is the Federal Act does not specify a process for determining client eligibility for CSBG services, and so there is no set eligibility process that community action agencies have to follow. States may specify a process that CAs have to follow, or in the absence of that, CAs can adopt their own process. CAP will have a white paper Q&A on client eligibility where we lay out a few examples of different processes that community action agencies have developed. It's just important to note that these procedures give priority to certain populations as identified in their community needs assessment. So these could include individuals with disabilities, individuals who are homeless, the elderly, or people with children under the age of 18.
Examples of priorities that a community action agency might develop. There's no federal for that, and as Veronica mentioned, if there's a process that the state specifies, a community action agency may adopt their own, and CAPLA's white paper gives, as Veronica said, just examples of that. It's not meant to be the be-all and end-all of client eligibility processes or procedures. It's just a starting point for folks to use.
We throughout the presentation that CSBG really is a unique funding source in that it does not really fund a specific service or program, unlike a lot of other federal and state funding sources. And it does not function as a standalone program either. Eleanor read from OCSIM Information Amendment 37 earlier, which indicates that CSBG funds may be used to undertake a broad range of activities, including linking and strengthening other anti-poverty programs and services. So the next few slides talk about some of the coordination and linkages activities that are permitted by CSBG, and again, states have the discretion to interpret the federal CSBG Act and relying on OCSIM 37 to determine which are allowable and unallowable CSBG expenses. So M37 specifications that CSBG funds may be used to support creation of new programs and services, as well as augmenting existing programs and services. The examples it provides is that CSBG funds can be used to support the development and expansion of innovative community-based youth programs. Again, that's just an example of use of CSBG funds to augment existing programs and services. And CSBG funds can also be used to support organizational infrastructure that's required to coordinate, enhance multiple programs and resources that address poverty conditions in the community. It's to see that CSBG funds can be used to fill sort of identified gaps in services and supports, both internally within a community action agency, and so linking different programs and services that community action agency, or it could be used to facilitate linkages between programs offered by other social services agencies. And the purpose of CSBG, again, is to improve the effectiveness of service delivery in the community, to avoid duplication of services, and coordinate amongst a number of providers in the community.
And also, I might just jump in and note how this flexibility has been so important for our network over the years, and really has provided the seed money for many community action agencies to create innovative and new programs in their communities to meet their specific needs of their communities, that then later they were able to, get funded through other funding sources or additional funding sources. And so it's just, I just can't speak enough about how that CSBG has provided almost like an engine for innovation among CAAs in their communities.
IM 7 does specify some examples of coordination, and so these are, again, just examples of, and not the only ways that CSBG funds can be used to coordinate services, but for example, creating and maintaining a computer network among multiple service providers in a community, perhaps as part of a common intake or referral system. CA has been used to develop and operate one-stop centers that house multiple service providers, even if those other programs are funded by different funding sources. It could be used to coordinate community-wide needs assessment, so not just for the action agency, but community-wide, and helping a number of different agencies engage in strategic planning, or compiling, publishing, and distributing information to give clients who come in these doors a sense of all the programs and services available in that community. So again, some of the examples of stability and coordination that CSBG really offers. To talk about a few specific types of functions, the next few are based on some questions that we've received and what the CSBG Act specifically calls out. So for information and referrals, we often get the question, may CSBG funds be used to provide general information on services or benefits that are involved in the community, or to provide referrals to other services providers, and does the community action agency have to do eligibility determination before providing these referrals? And these are that community agencies may provide information and referrals either to non-CSBG services and benefits without having to go through the eligibility determination process. And our sort of conclusion is based on the fact that the federal CSBG Act specifically calls out information and referrals as uses of CSBG funds, and requiring individuals who are seeking information and referrals to go through the eligibility intake process may deter them from coming to the community action agency. And so the fact that the federal act calls out information and referrals to us, provide support for that conclusion that CSBG funds can support members who are just providing information and referrals, even if those individuals don't qualify for CSBG funded services. And is whether CSBG funds can be used to support intake and eligibility screening. And again, our answer is yes, that can pay for a staff member's time who is conducting intake and eligibility screening, even if at the end of the day that client is determined to not be eligible for CSBG services. CS funds in our view, can be used to pay for staff time and expenses to provide those non-CSBG eligible clients with infant on and referrals to other services. Next quiz, which asks these two questions. The first is, may only use CSBG funds to provide direct services to clients, true or false? And second, may use CSBG funds to provide information and referrals only to clients it has determined are CSBG eligible. So again, we'll give you a moment just to select those answers. Let's go ahead and close the poll. Looks like almost everyone got the right answer for both, and it's false to both. I mentioned CSBG fund linkages and coordination activities, so not just direct services to clients. And on the second question, again, that CSBG funds can be used to provide information and referrals to folks who are determined to not be CSBG eligible. Right, so let's talk about buildings and facilities. Again, another common area of questions that we receive on how CSBG funds may be spent. So the CSBG Act says that CSBG funds may not be used for either the purchase or improvement of land or the purchase, construction, or permanent improvement of a building or other facilities. There is an exception for low-cost residential weatherization or other energy-related home repairs. But generally speaking, the two prohibitions, purchase or improvement of land and purchase, construction, or permanent improvement of buildings or other facilities, is not allowable CSBG cost. So states, again, have the discretion to determine whether or not an expense is prohibited by this provision. So states have discretion to determine whether or not it is following one of these two prohibitions. And if a state chooses to, it can also ask the Federal Office of Community Services for a waiver for extraordinary circumstances. Some examples of waivers have been granted include, and the first one being particularly relevant of events, but example of a waiver that OCS has granted in the past is human suffering and destruction of property caused by natural disasters such as floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, or earthquakes. There's also granted for an exceptionally high incidence of poverty, such as an open drainage ditch being used for sewage in a local neighborhood. These all specified in OCS IM 60. So if states are interested in petitioning the Office of Community Services for a waiver, you can look to the guidance that's provided in IM 60. The states show that permitting waiver will contribute to the state's ability to carry out the purposes of the CSBG Act, and so you would just need to make arguments for why that's the case. And to note that it's not the community agency that petitions the Federal Office of Community Services, it's the state that would choose to do so. So these two prohibitions, not all building-related expenses are unallowable costs. Mainly maintenance and repair costs are permitted. So maintenance and repair costs are, again, cost to the purchase, construction, or permanent improvement of a building or facility. And there isn't much guidance on what a maintenance and repair cost could be, but there are, we do a Q&A that was dated last year on property issues that addresses what be an allowable maintenance and repair costs. And generally speaking, these are costs that contribute to upkeep of buildings and equipment, but don't add to the permanent value of the property or appreciably prolong its intended life. Really meant to keep that property or the facility in efficient operating condition. These are considered maintenance and repair costs. Depreciation is also an allowable cost, and so commission agencies may charge that to their CSBG grant. One question before we move on buildings and facilities. The Federal CSBG Act generally prohibits the use of CSBG funds for, and you should select all that apply. The first is purchase or improvement of land, B, maintenance of or repairs to a building to or other facility, C, purchase of a building or other facility, and construction or permanent improvement of a building or facility. So you can select all the answer choices that apply here. And close the poll. So most folks got the answers, which were A, C, and D. So the CSBG Act does not prohibit costs of maintaining or repairing a building or other facility, but the other answer choices are prohibited.
To wrap up here with the use of CSBG funds with a couple other topics. So one is, can CSBG funds be used as a match? The Federal CSBG Act is silent about the use of CSBG funds as a required match for other federal programs, but you need to look to the OMB uniform guidance, which permits use of federal funds as a match in certain circumstances. And what our take is that states and CAAs should use CSBG funds as a match only in accordance with written guidance from the Office of Community Services. I've issued guidance in a couple of cases. So they've issued guidance saying that CSB funds may be used to meet matching requirements of HUD's McKinney-Vento homeless assistance programs and also Corporation for National and Community Services AmeriCorps program. Rule CSBG funds may not be used as a match for other federal programs. Carryover, there's some confusion about this. Just to let you know that there's, we talked about how Congress appropriates federal funds, and including CSBG funds, every year. And so in the Federal Appropriations Acts each year, there is language around CSBG. And that language doesn't only say how much funding is appropriated for CSBG, but it includes some substantive provisions, and one of those provisions has to do with carryover. So this Federal Appropriations Act language that's been in there for quite a number of years permits CAAs to carry over into the next fiscal year and distributed to an eligible entity by the state and have not been expended by the Community Action Agency. They may remain with it for carryover into the next fiscal year, consistent program purposes. And so just note that this language takes precedence over the CSBG Act, which, as I mentioned, was originally passed in 1981, last reauthorized in 1998. And so, but the Appropriations Acts are passed every single year, so they're more recent than the last reauthorization of CSBG, and so therefore they take precedence over it. So the CSBG Act only permits a CAA to carry over up to 20% of its CSBG funds distributed to it by the state for the fiscal year, but just note that that language is taken, takes a seat to this appropriations language that permits CAAs to carry over funds into the next fiscal year. We do see, when we look at state CSBG contracts with CAAs, those contracts do cite the language in the CSBG Act about the 20%, but they do not acknowledge the more recent Federal Appropriations Act language. So I just urge attorneys to take a look at your state contracts and make sure that they reflect the current language around carryover that's from the Appropriations Act. The CSBG Act requires CAAs to inform custodial parents and single-parent families that participate in CSBG-funded programs and activities about the availability of child support services and refer eligible parents to those child support offices of state and local governments. In our understanding, generally those child support offices are state agencies. And so if the state doesn't have its own policy around this, CAAs can develop their own policies about how they're going to meet this requirement of informing parents and custodial parents and single parent families about child support services. And we have Q&A on that gives some sample language that community action agencies can use if they want to. Turn to monitoring. States are subject to monitoring by OCS. So OCS staff go around the country, and I'm sure many of you have met with them in their reviews of your state. And they, as the grantees, the OCS and the have a relationship with the states, which are the grantees. So OCS looks at the states, but state CSBG offices are required to conduct reviews of community action agencies. So there's a full on-site review at least once every 3 years. If there's a newly designated entity, then the state is supposed to do a review, an on-site review after the first year. The state may do other reviews as appropriate, and also is required to do a prompt follow-up review of any community action agencies that fail to meet goals, standards, and requirements established by the state. As at the beginning of the presentation, the fact that states can't just up and terminate or reduce funding for CSBG funding for community action agencies, there's a process that has to be followed, and so we're going to walk through that process right now. So if there is if the state is seeking to reduce or terminate funding due to monitoring findings, this is the process that needs to happen. So first, the state monitors and has some findings, conducts follow-up reviews as needed. If those findings, if the state determines one or more of those findings to be a deficiency, they must inform the action agency of what that deficiency is and what acts must be taken to correct it. And as part of that, normally provide training and technical assistance and or allow the community action agency to put together and submit to the state a quality improvement plan. Then if the state, to correct the deficiency, then the state must provide notice and an opportunity for a hearing on the record if that deficiency hasn't been corrected. And then the state has to determine whether cause exists for reducing or terminating funding and initiate that reduction or termination. Then there's an opportunity for federal review by HA of that decision. CSBG Act doesn't define the term deficiency, but it defines the cause that a state must determine exists in order to initiate a reduction or termination in funding. And that term cause includes the CAA's failure to comply with the terms of its CSBG agreement with the state plan, or a state requirement. However, just keep in mind that while this process is going on, the state may not discontinue present or future funding until this whole process has been completed. And processes are spelled out both in the Act itself, in 42 United States Code Section 9915, as well as 9908. And also in an Information Memorandum, OCS Information Memorandum 116. There could be a funding reduction that results from the statewide redistribution of funds, sometimes the states decide that they're going to redo the formula state or do some other kind of redistribution. And in order to change that formula, this has to show that cause exists, and there are only 3 reasons for this purpose that constitute cause. So one is results of the most recently available census or other appropriate data. There is designation of a new eligible entity or severe economic dislocation. And so if one of these, if the state is redoing the formula or otherwise changing the distribution of funds among CAAs within the state, it needs to do so for one of these reasons or one or more of these reasons. And then for the community action agencies that might be negatively affected and have their funding potentially reduced, the state has to provide notice and a hearing on the record and opportunity for federal review. And then, as I mentioned, OCS, that may review the state's decision, the CAA has to request that. And so that OCS review is supposed to be completed within 90 days after it receives all necessary documentation from the state about the decision to terminate or reduce funding. If the OCS review is not completed within that 90-day period, then the state's determination becomes final. It can also provide direct funding to a CAA, one or more CAAs, if the state terminates or reduces a CAA's CSBG funding before that hearing takes place or opportunity for a hearing and before OCS reviews the decision. So I mentioned at the outset of this presentation that sometimes there are situations of budget impasses in states, and so in the cases, sometimes the CAAs have petitioned OCS for direct funding. I don't know that OCS has provided direct funding in those circumstances yet, but I know they've set themselves up that they could do that. But that's just one example of where one or more CAAs might request direct funding from OCS. It could be done by an individual CAA if the state has terminated or reduced their funding without going through all the steps that we just talked about. A quiz here about termination. A state may terminate a CAA's CSBG funding by simply sending CAA written notice of its intent to terminate the funding. True or false? A pretty short question, so I think we'll wrap up the quiz in about 5 seconds. Okay, the quiz is closed. You folks are correct that the answer is false. The state may not just simply decide to terminate and send a termination notice. It has to go through those procedures that we discussed previously about providing notice and an opportunity for a hearing and determining that cause exists. In case of findings or deficiencies that come up through monitoring, notifying the CA of what the deficiency is and allowing them an opportunity to correct it. A state may designate a new community action agency if an area is not served or ceases to be served. There are some states actually, CSBG covers 99% of the counties in the U.S. There are a few states that have pockets that are not covered, so a state conceivably could decide to create or allow for the creation of a new CAA in those areas or have existing entities apply to serve those areas. So a state could designate a new CAA in that instance, or if a CAA either gives up its designation voluntarily or has its designation and the CSBG funding terminated, a state may designate a new CAA. In the situation as it indicates on the slide, however, the state may not designate that new CAA as the subgrantee until the state has and OCS has had the chance to review the situation Their designation process in the federal CSBG Act, it says the state may solicit applications in these circumstances. So states need to develop their own processes for designating new entities. It's important to keep in mind that if the state is designating a new CA, the federal CSBG Act requires that nonprofit organizations get priority, and only if there is no nonprofit organization identified or qualified may the state look to a political subdivision, in other words, local government, to serve as the eligible entity in the area. And this is spelled out in 42 U.S. Code 99, Section 9909, as well as in OCS Information Memorandum 116. Also, the block regulations provide that community action agencies and others may file complaints with the Federal Office of Community Services that a state has failed to use CSBG funding in accordance with the CSBG Act and the state's assurances that it made in the state plan. And that provision is in those block grant regs that we talked about at 45 Code of Federal Regulations 96.5. OS will defer to the state's interpretation of the CSBG Act unless the interpretation is clearly erroneous. Concludes the substance of our presentation today. This is funded through a training and technical assistance grant issued by CS to CAPLA, but we are happy to answer any questions that folks might have at this point. Either come into the chat channel or folks at NASCAS are going to mute folks who might have questions. So NASCAS team, maybe do you want to just let people know what to do if they want to ask a question?
Should everybody, but we heard music instead. So I think we'll keep people muted, and if folks have a question, they could type it in the chat bar.
Okay. Also, maybe if you could put the handouts back on the screen that folks could download if they want to and weren't on the webinar at the very beginning.
Sure. Everybody should be seeing a file transfer prompt up on their screens. They just need to click on the file and download if they're interested.
So NASCAS will be making available a recording of this webinar, which we do urge you to share with your colleagues in your offices, as well as if you're an attorney, with the attorney or attorneys that might work with your office. And so please go to our website, capla.org, for some of the materials that I've mentioned, but we have lots and lots of other resources there on many topics, the Q&As that we touched on around CSBG issues, as well as many resources on tripartite boards, including tripartite board composition and selection, as well as role of public tripartite boards. We have a couple of modules, including one on an introduction to the CSBG Act that goes into even more detail than we did today about the provisions, and also a model for public CAAs. But do urge to check out our many resources, toolkit, webinars, and the like on our website.
And Eleanor, we are not seeing any questions. There's a great webinar with lots of information. So if anyone has follow-up questions for Eleanor after, or Veronica after this this call, feel free to reach out to them. Feel free to reach out to us. The PowerPoint will be saved on the member portal, and if you need any help accessing that, contact Cindy Hummel at our office. And other than that, I guess thank you all for joining us this afternoon.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity. Look forward to seeing you out and about.